So it is now my pleasure to introduce the first panel discussion, which is on gender equality. And Andrea Flynn is our moderator, and she will introduce the panelists. So again, this is going to be a repeat of earlier. If you have any questions, we will have folks walking around with yellow cards so you can write your comments and questions on them, and we will collect them towards the end of the panel discussion. Andrea?
Is it on? Great. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping issues. We have 45 minutes for this conversation, and then we're going to move to Q&A. So I'm going to try to be a taskmaster of sorts and keep us on topic as much as I can, keep things moving along. I also wanted to let you know there have been some shifts in the panelists between this panel and the next panel. So just note that what's in your pamphlet is not up to date. I'll introduce everyone now and again on the second panel. As Dorothy said, my name is Andrea Flynn. I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute here in New York City, and as a fellow I do research and I write about the intersection between economic security and mostly health issues, but also do a good deal of work on race and gender issues. We like to call Roosevelt a think and do tank that's inspired by the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And at Roosevelt, we try to reimagine America as a place where all people can share in the prosperity of the country. And that when the rules are not working to allow everyone to share in that prosperity, that it's our responsibility to rewrite and reimagine them. Sometimes people speak of inequality as if it is inevitable, as if it's just an accident of history. But at Roosevelt, we like to say that inequality is a choice and that we can make different choices to create a more equitable world. And I think today is a really perfect opportunity to reflect on the moments in history when we have tried to move the needle and create a more equitable country, and to also think about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. So we're lucky today to have three panelists who couldn't be better suited to help us think about that history and also about the obstacles and opportunities that lie ahead. I'm not going to go too deep into each of their bios because you have them. They're very impressive. I recommend you read them all in detail. But I thought to get us started, it would be great to hear a little bit about their personal stories. To my left, we have Allida Black, Alondra Nelson of Columbia, and Suzan Harjo. I'm going to ask them each to take 2 minutes or so to tell us a little bit more about themselves. What brings you to this work? How did you start doing human rights and gender equity work? And knowing that you've surely had many hard-fought battles, what keeps you in the work?
Well, I have to say what keeps me in the work is Eleanor Roosevelt. What inspires me is Hillary Clinton. What made me mad that got me started was I was 22 years old, a junior at Emory, had talked my way into a full-time internship when Jimmy Carter, when he was governor, helped rewrite the rape legislation for the state of Georgia and helped with maternal and infant health care legislation. I was hired, and then I was summarily fired because they thought I was a lesbian. So I thought in 1974, if they were going to do this, then I'm just going to live my life anyway. I ran various nonprofits, and then in 1984, I went to graduate school to get a PhD in history to learn how to keep people at the table. Was fortunate enough to get support from the Roosevelt Institute to look at Eleanor in a whole new way. I started out doing Eleanor and democratic politics. I ended up doing Eleanor and human rights around the world. And for those of you who are struggling to think about what to do if you are a humanities major, think outside the box. If you had asked me in '93 that my dissertation would take me to 19 post-conflict countries, I would say, what are you smoking? And there's not a day, especially in the past 4 years, that I do not take courage from, learn from, adapt a negotiation strategy from Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think she is the most underappreciated leader of the 20th century.
Thank you. Alondra?
Yeah, thank you. Allida's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. I'm so honored to be here this morning with Allida and with Suzan and Andrea and with all of you for this conversation. So, why am I here? In part because I'm a scholar that works on intersectionality, effectively, the intersection of race and class and gender. I'm the Dean of Social Science at Columbia, but my appointment actually is a joint appointment in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, which I was the former director of at Columbia, and in the Department of Sociology. So that really, I was lucky to be of a generation of scholars when I was getting my PhD, in which you no longer had the sort of gender chapter. There was a sort of sense that the generation before me, you had to have a chapter on gender in your dissertation, and my generation, I think, really became the one where it was woven through all of your work. I mean, how could you write about any topic in the US or abroad, about technology or about the arts, and not be always thinking about issues of gender? And then there's another part of my work as dean. I was glad in the last year to have helped Columbia be one of the first signatories to a new White House research collaborative to advance research on women and girls of color. And I spent a lot of time working in that space. We've brought a feminist seminar for girls to Columbia, working with the YWCA here in New York City. So that's part of the work that brings me here as well.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with these ladies and to address these wonderful topics and sometimes awful topics. I think the way I come to gender equality is through my mother and my aunt, who was, my aunt was my favorite aunt and what my mom called a good time girl. We went to the hospital and visited her, Aunt Peg. She had a broken back, and she was telling us how it happened. Her husband threw her down the stairs and then threw an ice box on top of her. At which point my mom grabbed me. I was about, 4 years old, I think. Grabbed me by my hand, pulled me out in the hallway, and started lecturing me. Don't you ever let anyone do that to you. So I didn't know what everything was that I shouldn't let anyone do to me. But I became a very hard mark at that point and very aware of things that could happen to you and you remain alive. So my main field has been my main life. My mother was Cheyenne, and I'm Cheyenne, a Cheyenne citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. My father is Muskogee, and I was raised in that way too, Hodelgie Muskogee, Wind Clan of Muskogee Creek Nation, and our tribal grounds, our ceremonial grounds, are Nuyaka. Nuyaka sounds like a Muskogee Creek word, but it comes from the Treaty of New York, and my ancestors felt so good about what was done here in New York with the United States. New York at the time, 1790, was the capital of the United States, that they did a ceremony at George Washington's house where they were having dinner all week that they were here. they were pleased with what had happened, and they knew that they were going back home, and that Hickory Ground was a mother ground and had 2 daughter grounds. And they, as daughter grounds often do, had the same name. And one of them had to be changed. So part of the ceremony was for the Treaty of New York, part of it was for New York, and part of it was to change the name of our ground. So they called it Nuyaka, and that was the sound that they heard when they talked to certain people and asked them where they were from. And they would say, "I'm a Nuyaka." So it's a wonderful Muskogee word now, and that's my tribal ground. So when I was a very young person, I moved to Greenwich Village and kind of never looked back. And then at one point moved to Washington, D.C. and never looked back. So I've had a wonderful career and several of them. One in radio here in here in New York, at WBAI Radio, 99.5 on your radio dial. And then news director for American Indian Press Association, and then I went way over the edge into advocacy, and have been doing that ever since. Mainly writing laws that become federal Indian laws or negotiating them. No one person writes a law. The shorter the law, the more people involved. That's the only rule that exists. So I'm a mom and a grandma, and love being both. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thank you.